men, and I use the term in a manly way today. We're back on this K model project, and I know this is going to be hard to believe. I was wrong about something, and the part that's hard to believe is that I'm admitting it, okay? Let me try to explain what's going on with this Kickstarter. I had speculated some things, and it turns out the speculations were sort of right, sort of wrong. Let me show you what's going on here. This is the kickstart shaft that came out of the bike, and I've replaced it because this area here had all been machined down. It's kind of rough and it's going to tear up the seal. I bought a new one, I put it in. Things didn't quite go as I planned them. But let me show you what I thought was wrong, and let me show you what was really wrong. This is the thrust washer removed from behind the kickstart shaft. And I had speculated, see the bend in it? See the bend in it? I had speculated that the thrust washer was, let me get this washer out of here so I don't have to worry about it. I had speculated that the thrust washer had gotten pinched up against the kickstart stop, something like this, and tightened down. And indeed, the bend would kind of indicate that that was the problem. And then, of course, when you go around on the other side and you tighten the gear down, this is just going to lock up on here because it can't go all the way in. That's not quite the case. I don't know why the thrust washer got bent, and that turns out it's got nothing to do with the problem. What has to do with the problem is the K crankcases in this area are different than Sportster cases. And if you get a ruler and you measure the thickness of the boss from the inside of the primary to outside here, and I can't show them both at once, you come up with a measurement of 1 9/32 inches. If you get a XLCH crankcase and you measure this boss, you come up with a dimension of 1 1/8. So the previous rebuilder had a kickstart shaft that pretty much started out like this. He put it in and found out that it was too short and not enough threads stuck out of the end over here. Well, enough threads stuck out to engage the end, but when you tightened them down, this hit the crankcase and it just pinched everything together against the nut. And I'll show you on the other side in just a second. So what they did was they removed this collar. And it looks like, I don't know, it looks like they did machine it off of there. There's marks on it that indicates it was machined. So that allowed more of the shaft to stick through the hole so that when they put the gear on, it would hit the shoulder. And that fixed the problem of it binding when the nut was tight. But the problem that caused is this. The flats stuck out past the face of the gear so that when you put the nut on, and here's that blue nut, and it bottoms out, it would never tighten up on the shaft. So this is going on the whole time. Alright, so let me show you what that all means from this side of the engine, okay? Here is a XLCH Kickstarter shaft. This is a used one I had laying around, relatively unmolested, okay? You put it in the hole, and the flats on the shaft on which the Kickstarter gear sits are below the surface of the crankcase. So when you put the gear on and tighten the nut up and tighten the nut up, Okay, and tighten the nut up. The gear bottoms on the crankcase before it bottoms on the shaft. And you can't turn it. It locks up, okay? So, what their solution was, and like I said, I kind of understand this, you know, you got this bike and, you know, something's broken in here and you just want to get it going again and ride it some bitch. And you can't get the original parts because they're unavailable anymore, of course, because they're antique. So what they did was this. You cocksucker. Yay. So what they did was they removed that spacer from the shaft so that the shaft would go into the case deeper. So here's what you get. The shoulder is now slightly proud of the crankcase, so that when you take your gear and you put it on here, the nut will now tighten up. Okay, so the nut is now tight on the shaft, but because they ground so much off, it's not tight on the gear. So they had this problem. Let me show you one other thing, because this gets even more interesting. So this is the gear that's had the boss ground off. I got another gear where the boss has not been ground off. I did do a little machining on this because I was testing a couple things out. But anyway, you get this other gear, you put it on there, you put the nut on. Okay. The kickstart shaft turns, the nut is tight on the gear is tight on the shaft, all is good, right? Not so fast. Here is the Kickstarter gear that came with the bike. The Kickstarter gear is held retracted by these side plates on the shaft gear. So the clutch hub gear should not contact the ratchet plate until you go to kick the bike and it pops out, okay? Actually, it's backwards. When the bike is Kickstarter is stowed, it's like this, so when you kick it, it goes like that. But anyway, the gear is held behind the plate. Now you put your clutch on. And I'm just holding it. The clutch hub is hitting the ratchet. Well, you can't drive around like that. That's going to make a hell of a racket. So the clutch gear has to be retracted farther. Or the other thing you could do is this. Okay, one of the other things you could do is get longer spacers to push the clutch out farther so that the ratchet plate on the clutch hub will clear the teeth on the gear. So here's a different spacer. And you should be able to see it's probably, oh geez, almost a quarter of an inch longer than the other one. So put the longer spacer in there. Then we'll put the clutch up on and we'll see if it clears the ratchet. And now it clears the ratchet nicely. Okay, problem solved, you think. Clutch rotates, doesn't hit the ratchet gears. It clears the kickstart shaft and nut, you're good to go. Wrong, because the teeth on the clutch hub now don't line up with the teeth on the front primary sprocket. They're out of alignment. So you pretty much have to use the shorter spacer. So anyway, of course the original parts, they're probably floating around out there somewhere. But what I'm going to do is this. This is the new shaft I bought. I've already machined the boss off of the shaft. This is the new gear I bought. I'm going to machine most, if not all, of this boss off. When I do that, I'm going to have the same problem that the original guy had. That is the gear, I'll find the right one. Oh, it's on the bike. The gear will be loose on the shaft and it won't tighten down. So then I'm going to machine off a little bit of the square on here so that the gear could go on all the way and seat against the nut. I may have to take a couple of threads off of this to keep the kickstart shaft from hitting the back of the clutch. So I'm going to go do all that out in the dirty shop, and we'll take a look at it when I get done, and hopefully it'll all work, huh? Alright, so after a few hours of screwing around with this thing, this is where I ended up. This is a brand new aftermarket kickstart shaft gear. This is the one that came out of the bike. I was going to put a new one on there, but it needed machining, and I didn't want to fuck with the new one. So I took the guy's old one and I just machined this entire area flat. And the reason for that is I found a website, came out of Harley website. I'll put the address down below. And they actually had a pretty good description of the differences in all these kicker mechanisms. And the one that was on the bike, this is flat. So I gained another 100 thou worth of clearance by machining off the uneven grinding he had on there. So we're going to go with this gear, and we're going to call this good. Just FYI, I'm doing 4 minutes of video or whatever about this. This is following 4 or 5 hours of measuring, machining, checking, rechecking, machine a little more, recheck a little bit more. So this is no 5-minute process on this. This took a while to figure this out, to get everything to clear the back of the clutch, yet work like it's supposed to work. So anyway, that's the kickstart shaft gears. Okay, and here's where I end up on the shafts. This is a XLCH shaft out of an engine I got sitting around. It is unadulterated. I don't know whether it's HD or whether it's aftermarket. But for comparison, I ended up machining some of this hex off so that when you tighten the nut, it'll go farther onto the shaft and thereby clench this narrower gear. This big boss is gone, and it's been replaced by this washer. This was a hardened washer. I bored the hole out so it's just a couple of thou bigger than the shaft. I ground it down so it's just the right thickness, so that when you put the gear on the end of the shaft, and tighten the nut down, everything still rotates smoothly. Like I said, I test fit this. Right now everything is clear in a clutch hub. It looks like I got about 3/16 of an inch clearance between the clutch hub and these parts. When I put the primary chain on, I'm a little concerned that the primary chain might hit this nut. The nut is going to be very close to the primary chain, but I should have a few thou clear. But I think it'll work, so we're going to try putting this together and see what happens. Alright, the seal goes in from the back side. The thrust plate goes in from the back side, and I'm putting a little grease on it just to make it stick in place. Grease seal goes on. The hardened washer, I'm going to also stick to the thrust plate with a little grease. Shaft comes in from the back side. Everything fits nicely. We're going to put the gear on. And once again, you got to get your slot lined up with the cutout on the gear for the, or the cutout on the shaft for the kickstart lever. Okay, the notch for the kickstart lever bolt is pointing up. This is the position the shaft is going to be in when the Kickstarter is up and disengaged, and of course you're going to kick it down and it's going to come over this way, hit the stop on the other side. So this is where it needs to be. We're going to put the lock washer on, and now the new nut. Now we'll cinch it all down, and with a little luck I won't have to take it off again. Please, if you're going to work on these things, buy a socket that fits. I see a lot of them with, you know, chisel marks and punch marks on them. And that should be good. So, 5 hours after I started this project a day ago, well actually 3 days ago, I think we got it where we want it to be. Shaft turns nice and easy. Everything should clear. And we should be good to go. And I'll tell you what, let's just slip this on. These parts all look pretty new to me. And once again, with the kickstart lever all the way up, the clutch hub gear gets pushed down by the plate on the other kickstart gear and holds it retracted until you kick it. So that should do it. Hopefully that's done. I drill these for safety wire. No particular reason other than I like to. Anyway, safety wire them, that way I don't have to buy the lock tabs, I guess. Alright, when I was test fitting the clutch hub, I had to put the front sprocket on so I can make sure the primary chain was lined up. And if you recall from the take-apart videos, this nut had a big washer underneath it, and it only had half of the threads engaged, so it wasn't on there very good. The problem you run into is when you set the sprocket on the shaft, there's not enough threads sticking out to catch and get it started to pull the sprocket on the shaft. So I did a little modification. I turned the nut down so that it has a shoulder on it. The thing I don't like about this is the nut is just barely as big as the hole, and the corners want to chew on the splines. So what I got now is this. I bought some heavy nuts. They're wider and they're thicker than the nut that was on there. And I'm going to run these heavy nuts, or at least one of them, out to the lathe and turn it down so that it's the same outside diameter below the shoulder as this. And these happen to be what are called 2H. And these are, I don't know what 2H grade was, and it turns out it's equivalent to a grade 9. Bolts with an H on them are boat builders grades. So a grade 9 ship bolt is going on this engine. But anyway, I'm going to go turn the shoulder on this thing, and that way it'll get started on the threads when the sprocket is off, pull it down in there, and the flats are wide enough that they'll go past the edge of the hole and should pull up nicely out to the dirty shop. Did you ever work on something and have it fight you the whole way? I run into those every once in a while. Okay, this is my heavy nut that I modified so that the shoulder would drop down inside the sprocket and give me a couple extra threads to get started on it to pull this onto the shaft. Anyway, after I made this, cranked it down onto the shaft, what I found out was that the sprocket seated deeper than I had originally thought it did. I had that other nut on there and I didn't get it all the way down. So this sprocket sat in and about 1/8 of an inch farther than the clutch hub. And of course there's nothing. It's like this part here needed to be longer. And I've come to the conclusion that I don't think this is a K part. It's exactly the same as some other Sportster sprockets I got laying around. And I think this is a Sportster part. I don't think it's a K part. The K part numbers are different. There are some different numbers in the book. And of course the pictures in the book are sufficiently vague that you can't tell what it actually looks like. And I've searched the internet for the part numbers in the book. Nothing's coming up. Nothing on eBay, nothing anywhere else. You do a Google search for images, nothing is coming up. So the K ones of these, I think, are probably pretty scarce. What I've decided to do in the meantime is this. Since it was about 1/8 of an inch too far in, I'm going to put this spacer on the sprocket shaft. The spacer fits just snugly over the splines, and it is exactly the same size as the area where the seal meets the sprocket. And I've done that because if I space this out, it'll lose contact with the seal in there. So I made this part with a sufficient degree of precision so that it should mate up with the seal nicely. Anyway, I'm going to go with this. If any of you guys know or have a K sprocket and either want to sell it or at least take a picture of it and show it to me, I'd appreciate it. I'm putting this together anyway, and the parts that are on the periphery of the engine, this is something I could have apart in, an hour, even after it's together, to swap it out for whatever else needs to be in there. So I don't mind, this is a semi-permanent, temporary arrangement here. But anyway, I'm going to go with it for right now. I think it'll work just fine. The only concern is getting a good seal around here. As long as the two sprockets are lined up and nothing hits the kickstart mechanism, I think we're going to be good to go. So we're going to go with this. All right, I'm going to smear a little grease on my spacer and hopefully shove it in that hole. There it goes. Nice. I'm going to give it a little tap. Okay, seated nicely. That's picking up the rear lip of the seal, and the sprocket will pick up the front lip. So I'm going to grab the chain and let's put it together. Okay, and here's some more weirdness about this motor. Somebody's obviously been in here not too long ago. We got the primary shoe adjuster. There are a few little scratches on this thing, but it's barely been run. It's brand new. The chain is a late model chain. It's not the kind of chain you'd find on an early model bike. Somebody's been in here. You know, they tried, they were close, but they just kind of failed at getting it all together. I put some anti-seize on my fancy heavy nut. You see, and there's, and see how deeply set that is. On the XLs, that shaft is longer and a larger diameter. So there's something going on here. I just don't know what. Okay, that's home. Make sure everything still rotates nicely. Make sure the clutch basket isn't hitting the kickstart stuff. Nice. I'll take that any day. Hey, didn't you just see me put the primary chain on? I think you did. How many of you noticed I forgot to bend the tabs over on the kickstart nut? Anyway, they're bent, and I forgot to grease the tube. This being on YouTube makes me so nervous. Jesus. Anyway, popped it off. Gonna pop it back on again. It'll be the same as I did it the first time, except now the tabs are bent and everything is greased. Let's hope it's easy from here out. We'll see. Clutch hub fits nicely. Lock washer. Big nut. O-ring is in there. Clutch locking device. Nothing more than some old plates. Primary locking device, just some flat stock and steel rod. Really finger tight is all the more these need to be. You get your big breaker bar. Click. And that's that. Once again, every time you put something together, make sure it still rotates. Looks good to me. Let's call that done. And let's call this video done too. That was pretty rough duty. There was a lot of work involved in this, putting this primer together. Hey, thanks for watching, and please subscribe. I am out of here until next week.